calling me on Discord. Oh shit, he's actually calling us? Oh, hello?
We're
Oh,
to the J.
hello,
What?
man. Hey, man.
Get out of me.
All right. Well, I wasn't expecting this. I'm very glad that you did decide to talk to us. I wasn't expecting this at all.
Well, I do like talking to people. I'm a very social guy. All right, what do you got in your mind? I'm a pseudo socialist, huh?
Yeah, you're a pseudo-socialist, man. Yeah, I think that
Oh.
your ethical takes are bad, real bad, like really bad. Like, so let me explain. So, numerous times in the Destiny debate, like if I'm honest, I think, and this was from an outsider's perspective, I think Destiny's ethics is absolutely trash, and I want to put that out there. I think he's a filthy
Mhm,
liberal capitalist apologist. So
mhm.
I just want to make that clear. So when Destiny's criticizing you, it's not because I'm a Destiny simp. Destiny doesn't understand ethics either. Not that I'm the only one that does. Just Destiny's not very good at ethics, in my opinion.
Well,
But
thank you for the opening
yeah,
disclaimer.
yeah. What I was going to say is essentially Destiny, I think, did show some inconsistencies in your position in relation to personal responsibilities in capitalism. You said that it would be okay to essentially enact roles in capitalism, such as a landlord or perhaps an Amazon CEO. I think that entering the capitalist
Well,
class as a
I said
socialist.
the former, not the latter necessarily.
Well, you said that it would be okay for an individual to maximize their, like, was it flourishing or freedom within capitalism, and that's a okay. And you even
So
referenced an individual like being a liberal, saying that they should get taxed more, but they're not doing it. And you said that you should be
So I
sympathetic.
said at
Sorry.
some point I might have said max. If I don't even know if I've said maximize beginning or if I've been gaslit. But when I said that, what I mean is I think that it is fundamentally morally neutral to thrive within an unethical system, um, given certain conditions. In this case, for me, the condition would be that the act of opening a new business doesn't actually further capitalism or harm any proletarians. Um, if anything, it has the potential to benefit them because they need jobs in this system. There's not much we can do about that for now. So no direct harm is done.
But aren't you a market socialist? Would you not say that they should, open a cooperative?
Oh, sure, I think that'd be lovely.
Okay, and then let's say they were a capitalist who, has the starting capital to start the business. Should they not, lend the money to the cooperative in order to start the business, and then indebt the cooperative to pay them back as a way to maintain that, like, they are providing the starting capital, but then the responsibility is to not, hire wage slaves. Like, can we justify an individual's, do the ends justify the means? Or, in relation to, giving
Well,
people
the ends
jobs.
always justify the means for me, right?
Well, but this is the thing. Like, when you say that you're a consequentialist, not always. Like, when we talk about like principles, like many consequentialists hold to certain principles. Henry Sedgwick being a particular one. Henry Sedgwick, and this is like Peter Singer, so on. They understand that there are certain standards from which we all must meet in order to maximize utility. That utility and utilitarianism is dependent upon not just an individual's engagement within a system, but the perpetuation of that system in one's normative capabilities and
Right.
universalized
I mean, yeah,
ethical
we can.
structure.
So we can run it. So my argument would be that the act of opening a business as a socialist is morally neutral because you're not adding harm to the world, because there's no negative utility being added to the world from your actions. Now, I think it'd be good. Now, that's neutral. I think it would be good if they went ahead and made a cooperative because I like cooperatives. I like what they do. I think that adds positive utility to the world. I think that'd be a good thing. I think we should encourage those people to do a good thing. I don't think it makes a person a hypocrite for doing the morally neutral action, even if they're a lefty.
Why is it morally neutral if, like, say, for example, the business wouldn't exist and hire wage slaves to begin with?
Well, because the people who went there to become wage slaves would just go be wage slaves somewhere else were it not for that business. Your
Mm.
addition of that business doesn't increase the amount of wage slavery in the world. Those people would have had to have worked anyway. You're not increasing the dependence the proletariat has on wage labor. You're just providing them another option.
Okay, I would accept that to be the case in certain necessary industries. I don't think that necessitates, like, so for example, like, and then again, like, you could also like create you could create a business which had a fairer structure. Like, there's no necessitation of having that, like, that business structure. You are basically abiding by the moral minimum of the state, which we have already agreed is deficient.
Well, no, I don't think that it's morally deficient to open businesses. I think that the existence of capitalism is morally deficient. But I think that about pretty much every system. I don't think there's ever going to be an economic system that I think is truly moral. There are always going to be problems with it, as there are problems with being an American citizen and flourishing within this country. If you do well in this country, or if you pay your taxes, you're implicitly supporting the stuff the government does with the taxes, which, depending on your opinions on the military industrial complex, could be quite negative. But all that added up, there's no additional negative utility being brought about by opening a business. Now, there are instances where something like that could add negative utility. For example, if you're an Amazon CEO, you have so much influence. You're not just opening a business, you have the ability to direct the market. As an Amazon CEO, you have the power to move people towards and away from certain economic designations in ways that regular business owners can't. So in that case, I would say if you have that kind of power, then you should be doing something, because if you don't, the ripples you leave in your wake are going to do harm. But that's not like a regular business. Amazon's obviously a beast in and of itself.
Okay, yeah, which I agree with. So what you would say is that an individual's like responsibility is directly tied to their power within the system.
Yeah, and whether or not their engagement in an action contributes to negative utility in the world.
Okay, so but in terms of like your engagement within the system, you could say that like an individual's like responsibility for the system is dependent upon their power and the propagation within the system. So as an Amazon CEO, you're able to propagate the system in a lot greater way, or yeah, undermine the system in a lot greater way. And so your responsibility for undermining it or perpetuating it is by and large culpable to your power. Like it's directly related to your power.
Yeah, because the more powerful you are as a business owner, as a capitalist, the more likely it is that your mere existence, that your power distorts reality around it. If you're powerful enough, you don't even need to do anything to further capitalism. Mere existence of your industry promotes and bolsters economic structures that you might disagree with. But if you just open like a hardware store, I don't think that does. I think that you're, if anything, you're doing a good thing in that case. You don't have the power to direct the entirety of the market or meaningfully contribute harm to the world, which is good. But maybe people in that town wanted hardware. And I mean, it's just, people get excited when a new store opens in their area. That doesn't mean the system's good, but like as long as we have this system.
Yeah. So what you'd say is that ultimately, like you're responsible, but would you not say that you're responsible for your actions within the system and the way that it perpetuates? So, like, for example, if I was to, not only hire someone, but then expect grueling hours from them and treat them harshly, like in the way that they do with Amazon, like worker
Mhm.
exploitation in Amazon, like very high quotas, like low breaks, like absolute exploitation.
Yeah, I would agree that one ought not do that. I would say that's a moral negative. I
Okay.
don't know how exactly you would quantify the line, but I would say that if you're engaged in exploitative business practices, not like exploitative in the surplus value sense, I mean exploitative in the more traditional sense. If you're engaging in those types of practices, or if you're engaging in behavior or paying wages that puts you like below par for what's expected in your area, then I think that would be a moral wrong on its own,
Okay.
because in that case you may be providing jobs to that area, but the jobs you're providing, you're making the choice to make them worse than what they could be otherwise if they went to other places in that location.
Okay, but then if we were talking like obviously Amazon CEOs one, like let's say if we were to say like landlords, you said that that's like
Mhm.
necessary. Like one, I would disagree with that. Like absolutely, and I think social housing, for example, is a viable alternative. And so if I was to disagree with being a
Can you
landlord,
describe social housing?
so like in Britain we have council housing, like as in like government owned housing, which is given to tenants, in which
Mhm.
they are the guardians of the house. They are given like essentially more freedom over the house, and they pay lower rent in relation to like the costs of living. So it's essentially government owned housing, right? Like state funded, right? Or
Yeah,
state
no,
owned.
I did clarify this in my conversation with Destiny. Right now, for the most part, there's basically just homeowners and people who rent out land. That's basically it. America doesn't have much in the way of social housing or communal housing or anything to that effect. But If you wanted to become a landlord and in doing so you were preventing the development of that kind of communal housing, then I think that would be a moral wrong.
But is that
In
not what
most parts of
landlords
America,
do? Is that not what
huh?
landlords always do? Because, like, if you look at it like this, if individuals weren't engaged in the process of becoming landlords, and we were to universalize that, like, if we talk about, like, obviously moral systems, as you do, um, the
What do you mean
reality.
not engage in the process of becoming landlords?
So what a landlord is someone who, commodifies, shelter, and then, rents it out at a certain rate, right? Now that is
But what
a
do we do to get rid of that? Like
well,
now,
well what
like as an individual,
well I
what
would
like
say
what do you?
I would say that one, not becoming a landlord would be a great start, in which case you don't enter the capitalist class and then actively politically advocate against landlords existing, which would be like, becoming a socialist and, moving towards social schemes, which, propagate like individual property ownership and,
Can't you
government
be a
ownership.
landlord and do that?
You could be a landlord and do that, but then I would say that you're contradicting your own interests. So like,
Sure. I mean, Engels did, didn't he?
well,
But if a socialist were to become a member of the bourgeois, I would expect them to counteract their own interests.
but what I'm
That
saying
would be
is
my expectation.
what I would expect is, in terms of a master slave dialectic, that the slave's job in the dialectic is to equalize their relationship by seizing power, whilst the master's job is to diminish their power and give it back to the slave. So in terms of like the being a landlord, I would say it's an inherently exploitative relationship, and that needs to be abolished. And now if you are a
Sure.
landlord and you could choose not to become one, or like you want a
Well, then
landlord rather, and you choose not to
how do
become
you
one,
rent then?
well, then you could obviously, like, what I'm saying is that in which case we're going to have a deficit in which this is going to need to be filled. The government is either going to step in or the housing market will collapse. And so the government will step in. And if the government doesn't step in, then the housing market collapse. But we're basically creating a level of political power which forces the government's hand, or we're not.
Well, that would what you're describing would cause an unimaginable amount of suffering to average people. We people need to very few people right now can buy a home. If that was the only thing people were capable of doing, we would we would see a precipitous rise in homelessness. The way our system works right now requires the existence of landlords or some system to allow temporary housing. But if you want a top-down social push, that's fine. But I don't think that like not renting out your property makes the government more likely to engage in housing reform.
No, well, like, look, if you've already got the property, then you're already responsible for it. That's different. Like, then I would say that your responsibilities are different. You could rent it out
Hmm?
at cost, for example, and then in which case you're essentially you're not enriching yourself upon the backs of another, right? So like that would be a separate like moral take. But in terms of like your responsibility in the perpetuation and like consolidation of more and more properties, I would say that ultimately, if you are consolidating properties, commodifying it, and then exploiting individuals who rent them by charging the neutral amount, as you say, like the market value in which the rent is done, I would say that you are doing the wrong thing. It's not that you are doing merely a moral neutral thing. You are precipitating the harm of the system, and the system itself is morally deficit. So, in other
Well,
words,
the system will continue to exist whether or not you. So hold on. There's one thing there that you said that I do agree with. The act of ruthlessly buying up properties and engaging in real estate acquisitions to form a rent market to become a little slumlord. Of course, I think that's a negative thing. I think that's a distinctly negative action. It's a bad thing to do, socialist or otherwise. But if you just have a property and you want to rent it out and you just rent it out at standard fare, I consider that a morally neutral action. It's
But
something that
but
would have
why
had to
would
have happened anyway
why
because
would
the system
standard
relies.
fare be a morally neutral action? Why would that not be morally deficit in the same way that you would be engaging in the system, which is morally deficit? So if you're responsible for your power
I
in
don't
the
think
system,
engaging in the system is morally deficit.
well, you said that we have our in relation to the power of the system, our moral culpability is relation to in proportion to the relationship in which we have power, right? Like our responsibility is directly in relation to power. So if we are capable of, lowering rent, so by undercutting the market, we can actively affect rent prices in that sector. So why aren't we doing it if we are charging the minimum? If we are charging the standard, all we are doing
You
is
should do it.
perpetuating that standard. Exactly. So I would say that you are doing the wrong thing if you are charging the standard, not that you are simply doing the morally neutral thing.
Oh, well, then at this point, we're just arriving at irreconcilable differences and where we place the threshold for morally obligatory behavior. I think that it would be a neutral thing to take properties that you already have and rent them out at the rate which is considered a fair market rate. I think that if you're a socialist, you should do better than that. You should rent it out at cost, or at least closer to cost. But I don't think it makes you a bad person to engage in the standard of fare. I don't think you're contributing negatively to to the utility in the world, because if you hadn't done that, if you just owned this property and didn't rent it out, then it would just be an empty property. If anything, you'd be contributing positively to utility by adding another house on the market for people to rent, because you would be providing more opportunity in areas that might be difficult to get a house in.
But how could you say that you're not doing the wrong thing if you're actively engaging in the standard affair, when socialism is an active rejection of the status quo and the propagation of a political shift? If you're a landlord who actively precipitates the status quo, and that is, the ever rising rent prices and costs of living, then you should actively seek to subvert that by understanding your political responsibility as a landlord in reference to your power within the market, should you not?
Yeah, you should do it. But if that's the case, your problem isn't with landlords. It's with landlords behaving irresponsibly. Would you have a problem with a socialist, a wealthy one, engaging in a ruthless acquisition of properties to form a slumlord empire and then charging everyone at cost? Would that be moral to you?
Um, what if someone was to, like, let's say, use it depends obviously in relation to, like, one, I'm not a utilitarian, so I'm not going to just look at the consequences and see if I can justify everything. I'm going to look at, like, essentially moral reasons, and I think that's what we need to do more, because I think at the end of the day, like, engaging in right reason, regardless of whether we are deontologists or utilitarians, is the only way that we can gain some level of ethical truth in relation to how we are behaving as being right or not. So at the end of the day, what I would like to see is whether the individual was using right reasons in determining whether they were actually creating a quote unquote better society, and whether this would create a better society. So if we universalize this behavior, what would be the result? In relation to the slumlord,
I strongly disagree with the premises with which you're coming at this, by the way. I don't buy into the categorical imperative.
oh,
I don't
well,
think we judge the moral worth of actions based on the universalization of those actions.
well, it's not about the universalization of those actions in just in terms of a categorical imperative. It's about the right reason in relation to those actions, which is even if it's utilitarian or not. Like, so for example, I'm not a deontologist. Absolutely, I'm a Hegelian, so that means that I'm actually a combination of deontology and consequentialism. Probably
Imagine
easiest.
unironically being a Hegelian after Marx owned you guys. Oof.
Ooh, but even Zizek's a Hegelian, and like any real base takes is understanding that like ideology is fundamentally expresses what material is in the first place. That materialism can't explain what the foundations of the dialectic in any ways. So
All right, okay.
So,
Well, get to answering my question now. We're getting too deep. I'm not a philosopher.
yeah,
I can only engage with it on a surface level.
I was gonna say, unless you want to start debating on something to do with idealism and materialism, then we're gonna go like on a sharp sideways tangent, right? But like at the end of the day, right? Like, what I'm saying is right reason is fundamental to all ethical discourse. Now, one of the things I hear you say all the time is essentially you're a pre-supper in relation to ethics. Now, I don't even think presuppositionalist. Someone who believes that they can assume what is, or state a moral axiom from which they are attempting to maximize, that they get to choose the foundations of their moral system.
You mean like I get to decide the axiomatic beliefs that I believe society should be directed towards fulfilling?
So like you get it. It's not like not necessarily the axiomatic, but it's like first, like when we talk about axioms, like we would be so like foundational first principles. Where would you derive them in terms of ethics?
So like axiomatic beliefs? I just want to make sure we're using the same term. First principles are axiomatic beliefs, right? Properly basic beliefs.
Well, yeah, I would say that where we derive our first principles would either be necessity.
I arrive at them purely through subjective preference.
Okay, through subjective preference. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you now is, how do you know what your preference is?
Well, I think that a preference is a cognitive process. So whatever preference I arrive at must necessarily be the one which I adopt.
Have you ever encountered what's called the Frege-Geach embedding problem?
We are very far beyond my realm of expertise here. No, I have not.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. The Frege-Geach embedding problem is essentially a take that's built upon what's called Wittgensteinian language games, in which we understand that language can only exist in a common domain, right? That private language cannot exist. And so when I talk about something that is private, I that I cannot speak about that which is private, but more so that in relation to argumentation, if I am talking and referencing something that is private, I can't know what I am talking about except from my current interpretation of it. So if I say, this is a chair and that is a table, and what I'm referencing is a purely private object, quote unquote, and not something common, then I go back, I'll have no way to know whether I'm interpreting it the same way as I did before. And so the standard
Okay,
is
I agree with
always my
that.
interpretation. Yeah. So
But if we wheel it back a little bit, what does this have to do with you answering my devastating question?
okay, like sorry, wait, John, like what I was trying to say is in terms of like first principles, and you said like, look, you don't like where we're wheeling it back to, because you made a point about essentially like I don't agree with the way that you're approaching things in terms of the categorical imperative, and then I started
Well,
talking about right
I
reason.
asked you, would it be moral for a ruthlessly capitalistic socialist to invest and spave up a
Hmm.
bunch of money and then buy a bunch of properties and get a little rentier empire, but then to rent out those properties at cost, or maybe just a little bit above at cost? Would that be unethical?
Well, what I was going to say is that my ability to answer that question is dependent upon like reason itself and our engagement in it as a community. So like this is why I'm a deontologist, at least to some degree, because I understand that even an expression of the consequences depends upon my engagement within a structure of argumentation which exists between agents. We talk about whether the consequences actually would be better or not than the the means in which I come to them, and whether if people engage in this systemic in this moral system, whether it will ultimately maximize the consequences or not. So even if you're a consequentialist, you have to do that, and that's what I was trying to express, and that it has to be in between agents. If you're asking me personally, on like intuitionally, right now, what do I think? Would a slumlord who maximizes his own personal gain ultimately to only create a socialist, well, not a socialist, it would be like a more socially like valuable like scenario. I would say that there are like two kind of caveats to this. If he uses means in which we say is justified in relation to creating a certain moral end, would those means ultimately produce more harm than good? Like what institution is he engaged in and maximizing? If it's the being a landlord, then ultimately he is going to be causing the exact same harm that he is then trying to solve. So he's basically stealing a wallet and then giving, like, taking $100 and giving $5 back. He's producing the problem that he's trying to solve through philanthropy. If he's essentially doing it in relation to another industry, then he's creating another level of harm which we need to weigh against the good that he's producing. And now these are the kind of questions that I think we need to engage in. But ultimately, if we can undermine, like, so for example, the whole problems causing system, then that's what we should do. Not cause the problem rather than try to like solve problems through redistribution. I mean, hell, that's the difference between liberalism and socialism in the first place, right? We don't try to, apologize for capitalism. We try to subvert it.
No.
No, so you would say that we apologize for capitalism.
No, I would say that individual actions don't have much to do with institutional reform in this regard. I don't think that a person's decision to go ahead and buy up a bunch of properties and then price them or rent them all out at cost, I don't think that like bolsters the commodification of housing. I just don't see that happening. I guess if you got large enough to a point where you were like lobbying for a lack of housing laws or a changing zoning laws or stuff like that, then that would be the case. But I think that just on its face, the act that I described would be good because before people, if they want to rent in that town, they got to pay $2,000 a month, and Now they can just pay 1,000 or
But then,
1,500 or
obviously, like even
something.
in terms of the consequences, the actions in which he has taken will have consequences on the lives of other individuals. And
Like
obviously, if
who?
we well, like what has he done to accumulate the wealth, which has allowed him to own the property, which has allowed him to, to do this? You said that he's using unscrupulous business methods,
Okay,
that he's
well,
like a
we're
super
just talking
capitalist.
about landlording now, so let's not obfuscate by talking about how he got the money. But
But
let's just say he got really lucky in a couple of
it's your
trades.
example, like
Okay, well then he got his initial money by getting really lucky with a couple of trades. He participated in the GME fiasco,
right, he
and
won the lottery. He won the lottery.
yeah, okay, he won the lottery, and he decided, fuck it, I'm gonna lower the rent for everyone in town. I'm gonna build an empire,
Well,
and I'm going to price everyone at cost.
but then that only bolsters what my point was in relation to personal responsibility in relation to the market, in which I said that, look, abiding by the status quo would be morally wrong. He's actually actively trying to subvert that market. He's trying to
So you do think it would be good?
it would be good if he was engaged in essentially undermining the current status quo within the capitalist market. But then I'd say he's a socialist in capitalism. Like he's not a capitalist anymore.
Well, sure. I mean, capitalist in the sense that he owns capital. But yeah, okay. So if you think that's positive, and I think that's positive, and I think that's lovely, actually, what if you just have a big old apartment building filled with 40 apartments? They're all rented. And then guy wins the lottery, and he thinks, you know, housing's a safe bet. And he buys that whole apartment block. Now the 40 rents go to him. He doesn't change a dime, but he doesn't add to or decrease the total number of people who rent, doesn't add to or decrease the total amount of social or economic capital invested in landlording.
He
Do you
maintains the
think that
status
is a
quo.
morally negative action?
Yes.
How so?
It's morally negative because he understands. I'm assuming that we're talking about someone who understands some sort of ethical discourse, so that he has some sort of ethical decision making, criteria. I'd say that if he understands socialism, then he understands that the status quo is currently exploitative, and so he would be perpetuating the continuation of that exploitation.
How is he perpetuating it? It was happening anyway.
Because he has now got the power to subvert it. His
Yeah, but it was
responsibilities
happening
directly.
anyway.
Yeah, but you just said that he's
The net
responsible.
utility hasn't decreased.
But his power to modify the utility has. That's an individual's responsibility, is it not?
I mean, it's good if they do that thing. I don't necessarily think that if a person is a socialist, they're responsible to do more. I think anybody should be expected to do more. But I don't think that's a component
But
of being a socialist.
it's not about him being a socialist as being responsible to do more. It's that he's a socialist, that he knows that we are responsible to do. If we have the power, we are more responsible than we have been, as in we are being irresponsible when we are capitalists, and that is wrong and bad for people to exist in capitalism. And so as a socialist, he understands that he should try to subvert the current system, to lower rent prices, to do the right thing in order to maximize the utility of the general populace, right? So being a socialist just makes him aware of his moral responsibilities. The capitalist is doing the wrong thing because capitalism is wrong and they are perpetuating that system. But being a socialist, if you are given the power of a capitalist, you should seek to subvert the system by doing what is right.
Sure, I mean, you can say that, but I can never say that an action is morally negative if it doesn't decrease the total utility in the world. Now, you could argue that a socialist would, could expect more from them. And I think I would agree with that because I've said that to people in my community. They say, Vaush, I'm a landlord. Vaush, it just came into some money, et cetera, et cetera. You try to give them good takes. But that's not me saying that this is now morally obligatory behavior, because to do so would be to suggest that I would impugn a person for engaging in an action which carries no negative utility, which would be a disruption of what I believe.
That's not true. One, there is definitely a utilitarian take in this in relation to principles, as principles themselves hold utility, and so the perpetuation of principles which hold people to a higher state of moral standard ultimately increase the consequential outcome. So if we were to say that socialists have a higher standard than capitalists, which they do because they understand what they can do, or that individuals that have power should act upon that power, then they can overall change the standard of society. And so by telling people that they don't have a responsibility to do anything but maintain the status quo would be absolutely wrong in relation to utilitarianism, because it would negatively impact the utility.
I'm just talking about positive and negative utility. I'm not talking about responsibility. I'm more than willing to admit or to believe that socialists should be expected to do more, or that they should be responsible for more. But I still can't say that the neutral action is a moral negative if it doesn't increase negative utility in the world. If you want, I mean, maybe this is like a definition or a semantics parsing kind of thing, because I feel like we're ballparking in the same direction. I think like if I had a socialist friend who was a landlord, I would probably lean on them to do good with that responsibility if that was at all possible. I guess I'd do the same if it was a capitalist friend too. Well, I would expect more from a socialist, I suppose, because they would know why my arguments were prescient. But I still couldn't say that them deciding not to would be it just doesn't fit with my principles, you know? It's like it's morally neutral. It has to be if there's no negative utility.
But there would be a negative utility of someone who, like, for if socialists didn't engage in like higher levels of activity when they gain power, because then it would always perpetuate capitalism, and so we would never see the removal of capitalism, which would be of negative utility.
Well, that would just be that you could accrue additional positive utility by encouraging socialists to act in more responsible ways with situations like this, which I agree with. But there's a difference between we need to encourage socialists to contribute more positive utility, and socialists are engaging in negative utility when they do X.
Like,
you know,
like one,
it's a difference that means something to me.
I think we're gonna, yeah, I think we're gonna disagree on that, which is fair enough. Except, what I want to understand when we talk about, like, when you say the words good, bad, right and wrong, responsibility, all these morally loaded terms, what any of that means, because it seems to me that there was a point in the conversation with Destiny, and I'm not gonna lie, I got so fucking triggered, and because I'm a vegan, I want you to know that I'm a vegan. I'm 100% a vegan.
I know you are.
Yeah, and the reality is that I see an individual's responsibility within society as being directly proportional to their engagement within a certain market environment. So if they perpetuate that market, they are doing wrong. Like, as you say, like if we make the markets bigger and we employ more wage slaves that would have otherwise not had to be employed, or we lower wages or whatever, and we actively engage in that, let's say we start enforcing like higher rents, we are doing something wrong, right? We are making the markets worse. It's the same thing with consumptive habits, right? We have a monetary vote, and we can, and you actually accepted this in the Destiny debate. Your argument against Destiny was that when Southern Americans were buying slaves, they were only being bought, they were only being brought over and enslaved because there was a demand for that, right? That people were purchasing those slaves. But then
if nobody was buying the slaves, then they wouldn't go through all the trouble of bringing them over the Atlantic.
100%, right? I completely agree. Same thing with animal agriculture. And that numerous times, every time a vegan has debated you use the words "no ethical consumption under capitalism," which is absolutely wrong and unbelievably irresponsible.
Wait, so do you think that like people are bad people because they buy clothing from corporations, or?
I think that if we can buy clothing in a way that was non-exploitative, then we ought to buy the clothing which is non-exploitative. So our market.
I don't think anybody lives to that standard consistently. We all engage in the petty conveniences of capitalist.
Even if we agreed that individuals do wrong things, that doesn't mean that the standard doesn't exist. Like, it's still a moral standard, even if everyone was doing the wrong thing. Like, even if, let's say, everyone is buying iPhones when we know that we shouldn't all be buying iPhones for an environmental reason alone, like, then yeah. But then look at it like this. If an individual, like, it acts as a wage slave, right? Like, let's say, like, with iPhones, like, the slavery that's produced to make iPhones. Like, what I would say is that, certain levels of technology are necessitated for normal living, at least in society today.
The problem is any conversation on this is going to be unbelievably arbitrary. Like which types of buying unethical products does more harm. I think these conversations tend to be unproductive because people are always going to be invested in defending the types of things they engage in. You know, people who don't own cars are going to be really hard on people who do, but then people who do own cars are going to be really hard on people who, you know, buy inorganic cleaning supplies and so on and so forth.
No,
I
but
just
like,
think it leads to a lot of dick measuring.
look,
If
there.
we want to talk ultimately about like consequential harm, then you know what? I will update my terminology for your sake because I think that you're correct in this respect. Purchasing meat, I want to be clear about this. Purchasing meat, dairy, et cetera, purchasing anything under capitalism, basically, though especially animal products, contributes negative utility to the world. There is positive utility because, as much as this sounds like a cop out, eating a steak does contribute positive utility to the world because it's tasty. That is a real thing, but probably doesn't outweigh all the fucking animal torture. So there is negative utility there. That is true. However, I don't think morally impugning people for participating in these economic systems is uh, generally very effective.
Really, because I think that discipline's incredibly effective, for one, and two, like, I think that what we are talking about is the implementation of certain principles which would ultimately improve the utility. So if we created certain standards from which to expect of other individuals in society and hold them to that standard, then we ultimately perpetuate the highest amount of utility. So I don't see why, as a utilitarian, you would argue against that.
Because there are social because first of all, then all of us would be bad people because we all participate in some kind of unethical economic consumption. So if you want to argue, then all of us are engaging in bad behavior and we should disincentivize it to the greatest possible extent, I would agree with you. My criticism is when vegans get super fucking head up their ass and act like they're the only people who engage in ethical consumption and that everybody else is a bad person. Not that I, as a utilitarian, give a fuck about designations like good or bad person.
Mm.
I don't even know what those things mean, really. But when it comes to people's behavior, what really bothers me is the inconsistency. I think it's better if we broadly encourage people to cut back on harmful or unethical types of consumption rather than acting as though vegans have like a third eye that they've opened and they're the only ones who can see the truth of the matter and that everybody else is like a fucking Hitler times 12
Okay,
for
so
perpetuating the animal
then
holocaust.
you would you reject then your saying there is no ethical consumption under capitalism? Because that's what you said. You said like, look, if you're saying that like, we should all disincentivize
Well,
certain
well,
like,
there kind of isn't, right? I mean, there are some places you can get ethical production from, but they're
but
pretty
like
few and far
you could, yeah,
between.
but there is like varieties of like negative utility even from a utilitarian standpoint. So I could say that, look, the amount of harm perpetuated from animal agriculture is by far greater than the amount of harm perpetuated by, like, I don't know, something like purchasing like I don't know, a banana. So like that's measurable in terms of utility, and that's essentially how you would engage with ethical actions in the first place, right? You said that you don't understand personal responsibility, but of course you do, because
Wait, what
personal,
did I
like,
say? I don't understand personal responsibility.
you said that you don't understand like what it means to be like a good person. Sorry, that you're a good
No,
or
that
bad
no, just
person.
those the term good and bad person are meaningless in a consequentialist sense. A good person would just be a shorthand for a person who does good things.
Yeah,
And a bad person would be a shorthand for a person who does bad things.
yeah.
But people who do good or do bad things, we all do good and bad things, and we all do them to varying extents, and those extents change with time. So the essentialist critique that vegans tend to engage in, where people who eat animal products are bad people and they conveniently ignore all of the other ways in which they contribute to unethical industries, that's what bothers me.
Oh, I don't think that people eat meat who are bad people. I think that people who eat meat are indoctrinated into a system which leads them to think that they are unculpable for their actions and that they ought not to do something about it when they have the power to modify the system to produce a greater overall consequence. To use
Would you
your,
levy that criticism against all people, including yourself?
I would say that is true against all people. Like, yeah, like I was indoctrinated. Absolutely.
No, no, no. I mean, like for you now, there has to be something that you do that you don't need to do.
Yeah, probably. I would say that, like, I'm trying to think of like of an example that would at least even be culpable to the amount of harm that is perpetuated by animal agriculture. But I
Well, if we
can't.
want to talk about if we want to talk about thresholds here, then yeah, animal agriculture is definitely a biggie. But then you could argue
Can you think of
that
anything as
animal,
big, nearly as big
huh?
even? I mean, as a utilitarianism, it's about numbers, right? We're compiling moral value, like one
Sure,
sentient being at
and
a time.
superseding responsibilities. So you could argue then that the reason why we can't meaningfully deal with animal agriculture is because of capitalism, and that you actually bolster capitalism when you order stuff off of Amazon. So while it may be the case that animal agriculture does more harm to society, you actually can't address the animal agriculture until all the greedy people who buy up all the shit off Amazon stop doing the stuff that they're doing. And then
That's
it's like, okay,
not true at
maybe
all.
actually, huh?
That's like, I'm sorry to say, but that's a really bad take, because you can address a single market within capitalism without addressing the system itself. And then two, you could also say that, look, you're like, yeah, perpetuating capitalism is bad. If you're funding Amazon, that is bad. But then it's depend, or it implies can, and I think that that's relative even to I think that's
Well, I don't say ought generally.
okay. But even if you
Um,
that's your problem. That's, or it'll be my problem, you know. But essentially, like, if ought implies can, which I would say it does, like if your ability to, if you should do something, you have to be able to do it. Then if you can't help but participate somewhat in capitalism, then you aren't responsible for the minor amounts of participation. Like, how far you propagate that system is what you are responsible for, which is essentially my
okay,
point about landlords. Like, if you're a tenant, you are enriching landlords. It just so happens that you are promoting landlordship. You know what I mean? You are actually promoting people owning and commodifying property. Now that's a negative, but you don't have a choice. You are economically coerced into that because you are the slave in the master-slave relationship. If you are the landlord,
you
you
could,
are
I
the,
think you could be homeless if you really wanted to.
if you oh right, and being homeless does what? Ultimately undermines the whole point, which is essentially that individuals are not being allowed to express like a minimum living standard by having a house that they can call theirs. So
Well, the point, if you back it up, is utility. You don't want people to be homeless because it makes them miserable, but it also makes people sad to not eat cheese.
well, I would say one, it's about subjectivity and its expression in terms of the freedom of the individual, which I think is a much better benchmark. But if you talk about, like, let's say utility, yeah, like cheese might promote positive utility, but it's nowhere near the negative utility of the consumption of animals in slitting their
Oh
throats,
no, I
and
mean,
it's the
the
same with
world is
homelessness.
literally
It's
burning right now
Yeah,
with
but it's
climate change
literally the
perpetuated
same.
by global
But
capitalism.
you've literally
Maybe
just
the ethical.
disproved
Wait,
your analogy to homelessness, because like you could choose to be homeless, but then by doing so you'd be producing more negative utility. So you are
well, you'd be
coerced
you'd be
on an
producing. Well,
ethical.
hold on. You'd be producing more negative utility for yourself. Maybe if everyone just decided to go out and rough it in the woods, sure, they'd produce negative utility for themselves, but they would destabilize global capitalism to the extent that it would no longer be possible to perpetuate global warming to the extent that we do now.
Okay, but the whole point of it being a system in the first place and a political action is it only destabilizes once a collective group of individuals gets involved, and a certain like threshold of individuals chooses not to participate. Landlords can't exist because there's no tenants. Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. But then obviously then you've made a massive homelessness issue, and so the negative utilities increased anyway, directly proportionate to the political advocacy of those individuals. So
Yeah,
which
but you
is
only
it?
have to do it long enough to end capitalism, and then you can go back to living in your co-op houses afterwards.
Well, one, like you've already one, like homelessness could kill you by that point, and two, that's like absolutely not comparable to someone avoiding meat, dairy, and eggs,
Do
which
you
causes
understand
them
the
very.
argument that I'm making, that this all feels incredibly subjective?
How
This
does
is
it
what I
feel?
mean
How?
about vegan.
Where's
Wait,
the
this is what I mean about
subjectivity?
vegans. Wait, hold on. This is what I mean about vegans, dude, okay? Vegans are you're correct, by the way, that when you purchase animal products, you contribute harm, and that we shouldn't do that. That's correct, and I've always said that on stream. I've always agreed with that. The problem that I get is when you get incredibly condescending to people who don't align on this specific take, but then you're incredibly permissive and defensive of every other type of commodity engagement. That's the thing that bothers me. If you came over here like a fucking Chad with your massive fucking cock and balls hanging out, and you were like, yeah, I'm actually talking to you right now with Wi-Fi I'm leeching from a library using computer parts that I assembled from a dumpster. I don't buy anything from the system. All people must maximize collective utility by living off the grid. If you did that, then I would have to say, fuck. You're objectively morally superior to me.
Or you could
You've
just say
taken a
that your
great personal
political
sacrifice to
advocacy,
avoid using your commodity purchasing power to contribute to unethical systems.
or you
And
could
if you
be
just came here to
politically
say, I think
advantageous.
people should do better on these issues in general, that would also be good. But for you to come here and say, hey, veganism's number one, veganism is the issue we need to be focusing on, and all these other things, we don't really have a choice. That's what bothers me.
You're a utilitarian, so veganism being number one should hold relevance to the amount of sentient beings which are harmed, which are considered equal under your, moral takes. And two, I would say that your political advocacy isn't dependent upon just like your engagement. Let's say you're homeless Chad leeching Wi-Fi, promoting that lifestyle, you're ultimately going to undermine the value of the subjectivity and the utility that you are trying to propagate anyway. It's not a rational take, and that's the importance of reasons.
Well,
You
I mean,
destroy
have
the
you ever
system.
like bought anything from like any store ever that wasn't a cooperative? There are lines here. If you, I can acknowledge that animal agriculture is the worst of them. I just wish that you would acknowledge that it's a gradient. Um,
Like
it's a
I can honestly agree that there is a gradient in terms of like, look, if you are buying iPhones unnecessary, like you buy a new iPhone every year, yeah, you're doing the wrong thing, absolutely. And I think that ethical consumerism is a gradient. I just think that the most pressing ethical consumerist action is veganism, primarily because we can destabilize an entire market. Okay, like not okay, we don't have to challenge the entire system. Like as socialists, we are taking a much greater endeavor than veganism. We have to destabilize an entire global capitalist climate. We have to destabilize the global economy and swap it out for something entirely different. We need to not only destroy this one, but we need to propagate a new and functioning system. All we need to do in veganism is stop animal agriculture, which is already not profitable, which propagates the suffering of countless trillions of animals, if we include sea life, and ultimately
okay.
is
But
entirely
this is
unnecessary.
again, this is what I mean.
But
You
what do you
still
mean?
haven't acknowledged it.
Well, I did acknowledge it. I just said that there is a variance. I just said that that veganism is the most pressing one, clearly.
But then you preached. So can we acknowledge then
About
that
you call
there are
how
many
could you say that it's
systems.
preaching? Like I just want to say, how can you say that it's preaching when you're a
I've never
utilitarian
talked
and you
to
and you expect that individuals have like a right to life or like or a value in their experiences at least,
That's what
like
I mean.
why would you say that it's preaching? Like that's what I want to know.
I've never talked to a vegan who didn't give me the speech. I think that animal lives carry inherent moral right. I've always believed that. If I didn't, I wouldn't advocate vegan ethics.
But you
But it's
don't.
always like I say the same thing. I always say I don't like the fact that vegans completely ignore all other ways in which commodity consumption can be unethical. They just like dive bomb veganism. It's really
But
hypocritical.
I didn't
And
do
then
that.
they say, huh?
I didn't do that. I said that there is all
Uh,
forms of commodity, all forms of commodification can be exploitative, and we should engage in relation to how much power we have in the market. And I've been incredibly consistent upon that point. I just said that we have the most power on veganism, and it's the worst one. So, in what way have I dismissed your position in terms of capitalism? I'm a socialist.
I feel like especially early on in this conversation, you definitely tried to circumnavigate the accusation that this is something that could be equally applied to a bunch of different fields. That was definitely an impression that I got initially.
No,
But I mean, if we want to talk past that, which would probably be preferable, um,
well, I'll make a quick point if you like. All I was saying when I was talking about necessitated markets is that there are certain markets which are unavoidable. Like, as in, like, as you say, like, for example, the consumption of a certain amount of food, water, and shelter, for example, as a society, is unavoidable. We are coerced into that by either
okay,
capitalism or nature.
but I'm not talking about needing to drink water that you get from your local plumbing tap. I'm talking about the a constant pleasure-based commodity consumption that people tend to engage in if
Yeah,
they are
like
not desperately
hedonistic
poor.
consumerism.
Yes, hedonistic consumerism. So, okay, do you think a person is a bad person if they eat meat?
No, normally I think they're indoctrinated. I think they're doing a bad thing
Okay, indoctrinated into what?
into an ideology which allows them to dismiss their responsibilities to the market and their responsibility for animal suffering and death. They think it's natural, normal, and necessary.
Okay. And what if a person thinks that like slaughterhouses are cruel?
They are cruel to both animals and humans.
Right. So what if a person thinks that? So they have enough cognitions to recognize that.
So they think that they're cruel, but then choose not to act.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a hypocrite.
I'm not asking if they're a hypocrite. I'm asking if they're a bad person.
Um, are they bad? What would I count as bad? Yeah, I would say they're bad because they're acting irrationally. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if you want to talk about what we mean by good and bad in the first place, I'd say that like when we talk about good and bad actions in the first place, we're talking about reasons. And I'd say that that has to be grounded. This is why I was leading to the Frege Geach and Bedin problem, because I think that your ethics is ultimately so ungrounded that your interpretation of what good and bad at any given point determines what you would say is good and bad. And since you always
What
say
have I
that,
said that's ungrounded?
well, like the words good, bad, right, and wrong, every time you say them are ungrounded.
What do you mean by ungrounded?
As in, like, flying in some sort of subjective vacuum in which you've just assumed, like, some sort of given end.
You mean because I'm not a moral realist?
Yeah, I mean that because you're not a moral realist, yeah.
Okay, I don't care.
But you,
Dude,
but
no
even,
wonder moral realists are so insufferable to talk
but
to.
you
Like,
could,
I can't dignify this conversation where you have not even axiomatically grounded your principles in the epistemological framework of reality. Come off it.
so
Axioms are subjectively
I'm
determined. They're
being
what you prefer.
insufferable, but you're putting on silly voices.
Yes, that is correct.
I think that that's somewhat.
Now, come on, you're telling me that that I'm ungrounded and that I can't make decisive takes on this because I'm not a moral realist?
Yeah, 100%. Like, do you want to? I was expressing the Frege Geach embedding problem, in which
I don't
basically
know the Frege Geach embedding problem.
you said that you understood it like about a couple of minutes ago.
No. Chat, did I say I understood I don't remember saying I understood a thing.
I follow
that
you.
sounded
I'm
like
with
that.
you. Yeah, I get it. And then you went back. But what about my devastating take?
Oh yeah, I might have just been ignoring you at that point because it didn't sound like it was relevant at all.
Oh, right. So
but you can try again if you want to.
Okay, yeah. So all I was saying.
Oh,
was
this the Wittgensteinian thing? Was this about how the collective idea of an object exists only insofar as
yeah, like look, even if you were like some sort of like socio-political like relativist.
I know Wittgenstein.
You know Wittgenstein, okay? So you understand that you can't have a private language game.
Well, I mean, you can for all the good it'll do, but it's not really meaningful.
Well, that's the thing. What are you saying is that you can't have... It's not a language. It wouldn't function as a language. You wouldn't be able to convey ideas. You wouldn't even be able to hold those ideas constant in relation to your own thinking. So you can't do it. You would say that you can't.
Yeah. So your argument is essentially that moral anti-realism is ungrounded because it's impossible for people who don't have the same subjectively determined values to have a conversation with each other.
Well, what I would say is that what I'm saying is that your position in relation to using words like good, bad, right, and wrong in terms of like creating a system in which you try and evaluate judgments is ultimately impossible if you accept moral anti-realism, and you should instead be a nihilist.
Why?
Because
I have values that I think are good.
What are those values? That's what I'm saying. Those values, you can't know what they are.
I can. They're my axioms. I chose them. I picked them out.
How do you choose your axioms?
I wanted them.
Okay, and how do you know that? Like what's
I know that I want them because they're the thing that I want when I think of them.
Well, that's the thing. So it's your interpretation of your desire at any given moment.
Yeah.
So,
but my desire at any given moment has remained consistent since I arrived at my first principles.
So how do you know it's remained consistent? Because that's the Frege Geach and Bedin problem, in which you basically can't show that you are being consistent from one moment to the next. That's the whole point.
Who cares?
So in which case, how can you say you're being consistent? You're saying is it that you don't care?
I am being consistent.
But how do you know
my
that?
Axioms change. My axioms change, and my interpretation of those axioms change. The world shifts around me and my perspective. Doesn't matter. Those positions remain consistent because they're relative to my axioms. But if the axioms change, everything else orbits around them.
Even like what I would say is even the words themselves, right? Like your ability to convey a certain idea. I'd say like your ability to even maintain any manner of argumentation falls apart. In which case, how do you even know whether socialism's good or bad?
I argue with people all the time.
Yeah. I'm not saying that you argue. Yeah, you do argue with people all the time. I'm not saying I'm saying you're doing it badly.
How?
Because I'm saying that you don't have any manner of holding yourself consistent, which you just accepted. You just rejected validity in terms of argument, in terms of ethical argument.
Whatever my axioms are is the consistency.
But this is how can you say you're consistent if you say whatever my axioms are is consistent? My axioms change all the time. I don't know what my axiom was to begin with. I argue.
Axioms don't
do you know
change
what an argument?
You're saying they might.
Do you know what an argument is? An argument is based off premises, right? So if your axioms are in multiple premises of that argument, right, then how do you know that your axioms are the same in both premises? And how do you know that in terms of this explains why you're so inconsistent in talking about destiny?
No,
because your
interpretation in the
interpretation.
slightest. Wait, explain an inconsistency in my conversation with Destiny.
So you start. So one, you start. So when like let's go back. So you started off by saying that an individual could maximize their that would be justified in expressing like the maximizing their capital with accumulating capital within capitalism, and that would be absolutely fine. And by the end of it, you are saying, look, an individual has a certain manner of responsibility, and certain capitalist actions are wrong. Like that wasn't that wasn't like your position at the beginning.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So at the beginning, you said that you should, you not that you should actually. I'll be charitable because I don't think you said that. You said that you that it would be good or that you can maximize your accumulation of capital within capitalism, and that'd be a-okay or good, right? Now,
I don't know if I ever said maximize. I still genuinely don't know.
go back, have a check. And then you said that an individual has a certain manner of responsibility in relation to certain like capitalist mechanisms, like they shouldn't like increase slavery or like make markets worse and so on.
Yeah, they shouldn't add to the negative utility of the world.
Yeah, but that's not how you started it. Like, and then not only that, like,
do you think this might have something to do with the with in a debate setting the ambiguity of language less so than my values changing? Like,
well, no, I think the fact that the ambiguity of the language is based upon the built-in ambiguity of what you just said. You just said that ultimately there's no foundation, and it's based on your interpretation.
I didn't say there's no foundation.
Yes,
the foundation is my interpretation of my axioms.
If your foundation is your interpretation of your axioms, then there's nothing holding your interpretation constant, and it's all subjective. In which case, there's no knowledge. Yeah. In which case, you can't.
It's the same for you.
No, it's not, because I would say that this relies upon a certain level of skepticism, which you're not going to be able to justify. So tell me then, how do you
arrive at your first principles, perchance?
Okay, so I would say through reason and through like necessity.
How do you know you're capable of making reasonable assessments about such a thing?
So what we're going Descartes' evil demon?
Yeah. Okay. I am actually. So how do you know? Oh, wait, hold on. Are you telling me that in order to be able to make formative statements about reality, you need to make unjustified presuppositions about the veracity of your cognitive abilities? Are you saying that the foundation of everything that you claim to be morally realist is actually based on a set of completely unjustified assertions?
Well, actually, it's necessitated assertions, and that's a separation. And
that justifies it. You have to accept the unjustified assertions. Well, I do too, my dude.
It's not an accept. No, it's not that you have to. It's not that you have to accept the unjustified assertions. It's that they aren't assertions. They are necessitated by everyone's rationality. Your moral axioms are not necessitated.
Condemned to subjectivity. It is a shame.
Well, no, because we just agreed that language is the fundamental way in which we understand reality and metaphysically divest objects, which is common between individuals. Did you accept Wittgenstein's?
Common between individuals doesn't mean there aren't subjective flares. You have no idea whether or not a common language actually means you're able to accurately convey empirical information.
This is absolutely the distinction between socio-political relativism or phenomenalism and subjectivism. So when you're saying that like subjectivism, we are all condemned to the subjective, no, then we would all condemn to like the solipsistic. What I'm saying is that there is a separation between the subjective individual and
I'm not solipsistic.
No, I never said you were. And by God, it's through luck.
No, it's not.
Okay, right.
You have any other questions I can answer?
Yeah, like, do you actively, you said that you gauge that, like, rhetoric is, like, the art of persuasion, right? And that everything's rhetoric and that you basically care about winning, right?
Well, I mean, winning's nice.
Yeah, and so what do you win when you behave like this?
Like how I currently am?
Like, in terms of choosing...
I have no respect. After my convo with Rem, I have no respect for snobby moral realists coming in and telling me that I can't make arguments because I'm a moral anti-realist. When from my perspective, you're the one deluded about the objectivity of the presuppositional beliefs that you assign. So it's incredible. I would never, by the way, talk with a moral realist and say, actually, all the arguments that you've made are based upon a completely unfounded set of certainty and a set of principles which you falsely believe to be objective.
Yeah,
I would never be condescending enough to open an argument that way. You were the one who breached the veil, my friend.
No, I completely agree. You would never go so far as to say that a moral realist is making unjustified claims in relation to reason and logic. But I would probably argue that was because you have your limited capacities in terms of philosophy. It's probably because you got a sociology degree, right? Like,
I think I'm doing okay so far. I don't like moral realism as a position. All the moral realist arguments that I've read, and I have talked with philosophers because after my conversation with Rem, a bunch of PhDs reached out to me and had some really interesting
I'm a
conversations.
PhD student, and honestly, and when we look at PhDs in philosophy, most of them are moral realists. Yet you say, oh, they're deluded.
I think they're wrong. Yeah, I have my own position.
But then, look, like that would be fair enough if
And
you
by
could
the way, all the
rationally.
moral realist arguments that I've heard rely upon the assumption that people have a fundamental shared set of values that are kind of inherent to the human experience, which has never sat right with me. That's the common argument that I've heard in favor of moral realism. But I reject that. I know there are people who don't share those foundational assumptions. There are absolutely people who, through mental illness or through really weird socialization, adopt principles that are antithetical to what we would expect to be common to the human experience.
Like, what
There
do
are
you mean?
definitely ones that
Like,
humans tend to have in
I'm actually
common.
interested in what you're saying there. So, like, what do you mean by that? Like, in terms
I
of
think
like mental illness and like the acceptance of certain like non-necessitated like axioms, as you would say.
Yeah, I think there are people who. What would the natural presumption of human values be? That humans generally value goodness and well-being. Vaguely, there are more specific axioms than that, but there are people who absolutely do not do those
Oh,
things.
I completely agree with you there, and I think that if anyone who understands, any level of psychoanalysis can show, like, like the Freudian death drive, people are actively trying to harm themselves. But then I would say that people don't desire a given, consideration of like well-being. I'd say that like sublimated in society, like that's absolutely the case. But then what we can say is that an individual values the expression of their desires in relation to value responses that they cannot help but feel. So if an individual experiences pain, the negative experience of pain is negative in and of itself, that it is
Yeah, but
necessarily negative
isn't this
by
like, isn't
definition.
this, we're getting kind of close to the Sam Harris argument, though, where there is a hell and we all know we do not want to go there. And from that belief, we necessarily solve the Izot gap.
Well, no, I mean, like, one, I'm not Sam Harris, because I think Sam Harris, he tries his best. Don't get us wrong, and I see what he's trying to do with the Azort gap, and I think that he's not entirely wrong. Bless him. I think
Oh,
that,
no, no.
like, I think that ultimately he's making a lot of unnecessary assumptions. I'd say that, like, if you want to know how to bridge the Izort gap, I'd recommend, and it's honestly it's a nice little read anyway.
But I
'Cause,
don't believe it can be.
well, this is the thing. You don't necessarily need to bridge it anyway. So I'll just give you the reading I would recommend would be Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. The first few chapters, honestly, brilliant for both laymen and philosophers. Really well written, really easy to understand, and he basically takes apart moral subjectivism really quickly. And you can get the audio. I know that you're like ADHD, right? Like I've got dyspraxia. I think I might have
No,
ADHD.
it's just no. The problem here is that I actually already read that book.
Have you read that book? Really? Have you?
Yeah, I talked with the author. He said that it was all
McIntyre.
bullshit.
Oh, fuck off. Oh, well, you got us as well. Fuck you. Right.
Mate, I don't know. I look, I'm there are probably excellent arguments for moral realism. The problem is because I'm a moral anti-realist, I don't necessarily think that there can't be objectively correct arguments for positions that I disagree with. I mean, if we're talking fundamentally about like first principles and like an epistemological rationalization of the world we live in, the fundamentally absurd world that we live in, it's entirely possible that I could believe with absolute conviction that I'm correct in this matter, and also believe with absolute conviction that you could be correct in this matter. Because I'm a moral anti-realist. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the arguments. I just got mad at you because you were saying that I argue poorly because of it. There was some language ambiguity in the beginning of the Destiny debate, and the reason for that is because I didn't realize that he wasn't making utilitarian arguments, which really confused me to begin with, because that's what I kind of knew him for. I expected him to be making arguments about what is good or bad directly related to the amount of positive or negative utility contributed to the world, but he adopted this really weird deontological assumption that like internal moral consistency is a virtue in and of itself, and that threw me off. So I started adopting terminology like good person, bad person for a bit, and it got muddled from there. I acknowledge that.
Look, I will say this. Like in terms of moral consistency, it is important for a utilitarian. And like as I say, in terms of principles, if you want to understand how principles impact utilitarianism, check out someone like Henry Sedgwick. Like he makes a solid argument for that under a utilitarian framework. Um, and look, and moving away from like the destiny like debate anyway. Like the point of what I'm making is that the Marxist critique is a meta narrative, right? So like if Marx in and of himself, in Marxism in and of itself is as a political critique of society, which is to show that the material what's the word, the material conflictions between classes are wrong. That the individual existing in the workplace, which is being alienated, it's wrong. That's like the fundamental point about it. Like that alienation is in and of itself bad, and he's making an ethical claim. And so, if, as an anti-realist, if you're going to say that like none of this exists and you enter like postmodernism, you legit become like a postmodern neo-Marxist. Now, I don't want to meme you, man. I don't think that like Jordan Peterson's right on the postmodern neo-Marxist like line of thought. But like
No, but I do disagree with Marx on that perspective. I do think that Marx is condemned to modernism in many respects, and that a single narrative can't accurately describe the totality of human experience. And I do think that the way that he made assumptions, well, actually, I disagree. I don't have a problem with people making assumptions about what is right or wrong based on their own axiomatic principles. I also think that alienation is wrong, but I acknowledge that that's only because I have a subjective set of principles that I only can justify through sheer personal preference. I personally want people to be happy because that makes me happy. It all boils down to egoism at the end of the day, right? But I can't justify it beyond that. I find that if there are people who disagree with very fundamental beliefs like human beings should be happy, they're probably better locked up in an insane asylum. I mean, what do you do to debate those people, you know?
well, this is the thing. Like when you say like it boils down to egoism, that's something that I could like more akin agree with. Like that people are like fundamentally like necessitated to value their own desire and how they engage within reality. Like absolutely. But then why would you say that egoism is built upon some sort of like moral anti-realism? If you say that we
I
have
don't think
to,
it has to be.
then absolutely. Then why don't you go from egoism to like even if you were taking an enlightened egoist position, that's an objectivist take. Like the reality is that if we are necessitated to agree with logic, which I think we are, like I don't think there's a way around that. And then if we ask what else are we necessitated to do, and it's value our own subjectivity, and then if that's the case, then we can build a system off those two things that's objective and will not fail in relation to the Azort gap. So
Yeah, but it's objective, so it's cringe. Also,
oh
I don't believe in it. I think that I act necessarily out of self-interest. If you wanted to, you can make the argument that everyone always acts out of self-interest because the only thing anyone ever can do is the thing they want to do.
yeah,
If you get really reductive about it, I mean, even if somebody holds a gun to your head and says you have to do X, at the end of the day, if you do X, you did want to. Oh my God,
sorry
that
about
was
that.
quite loud.
I know, sorry, I don't know why that's on. I tried to mute it
No
before
worries.
actually.
If you do X with a gun to your head, you don't want to do it, but if you did it, you did want to do it because you did it. And if you didn't want to, you wouldn't have wanted to. The term want is a little bit ineloquent in the
Well,
context of like,
I think that's actually legit, and that's like a Hobbesian claim. You can only desire like you always desire what you desire. But then when you enter first order desires, I would say that's absolutely the case. It is the case that you desire like ice cream, or it is the case you desire not to like be shot. You know, when you do that sort of thing. The point of ethics is engaged on second order desires, like the evaluation of whether your desires are expressing what you actually desire against like what end goal you are trying to achieve, or what is common between the system of drives. And that's Hegel, like understanding that you have a system of drives that we all do, that we need to evaluate it as a collective, understand the value that we are trying to seek, and then ultimately Jesus fucking Christ, I don't know how to turn that off. um I'm just gonna like fucking shit.
if you don't, they're just going to keep doing it.
I know. That's the thing. This is I'm fucking cursed. Because it says that the fucking alert box is muted. I'm gonna have to just delete it. Okay, there we go.
God's
Right.
sake.
But yeah, like
These are
honestly,
debate tactics. You're trying to distract me. I see through your game.
yeah, absolutely, man. Like,
Typical moral realist shenanigans.
100%. It's all a rhetorical tool. Like, what I'm trying to express really is just that, look, like we can build a system that's objective and like doesn't fall to these like problems that's necessitated. And if we can do that, then it's fundamentally better founded then
I
the
don't think it's fundamentally better founded.
but
I
how
would just think
not?
it's delusional.
But how? Why
I
would you
think
say
if any,
in what
I think
way?
this conversation has been, if anything, an indication that moral realism can assign to a person an unfounded level of confidence in the veracity of their positions. I like the world that I live in, by the way. Everything that I advocate for is derived entirely from my completely subjective opinions about how the world should be. And if anyone disagrees with those opinions, I can just ignore them or call them an idiot. It's way the fuck better than trying to
But
somehow
how do you?
extract objectivity from a fundamentally subjective frame of reference, you know?
Well, no. Well, like I would absolutely disagree, especially since the frame of reference can be metaphysically objective. Like we could understand reality as separate from ourselves, which is why we're allowed to engage in stuff like science, and science itself is objective from individuals. So unless you think science is subjective, and like
Yeah, of
history.
course.
See, this is the issue. Like I'm the one that's the fool for saying that science is objective in this conversation, and I think that's like, how am I the one with the bad take when you're saying that, look, it's a matter of preference, or a matter of taste, whether the sun
Yeah.
is whether it takes 8 minutes from light to go to the sun, like
Yeah,
from
of
the sun.
course. If you get even if you get into like mathematics, then you find that like things boil down to like highly subjective. Isn't epistemological mathematics literally like a field of study? It's not to derive some sort of realist truth about it either. It's like there are some common understandings of mathematics that we can't arrive at like fundamental assertions about it. It ultimately does come down to preference. But if everybody's working on the same set of preferences, then math continues onward. That's the nice thing about math and language. It doesn't matter if it's real. All that matters is that we all believe it is. And as long as we all believe it's real, world keeps on turning.
Well, this is the thing. Like, one, then there's two things to be said. One, I think that in terms of maths and language, if it functions like a language, then I would basically reference. You said Wittgenstein, so I'm assuming that you're taking that position. I would say that I would reference someone like Robert Brandom on inferentialism, where he says that the existence of P implies the possibility that P actually obtains. And in modal logic, this is what's called the necessitation rule. It's like the fact that logic actually can apply to reality. If we disagree that it does, then logic doesn't function anymore. So I would say
Well,
that
it can, but we agree upon what logic is and looks like. And the agreement we've made seems to work pretty well for us. So I don't see much of a reason to change it up, you know?
well, no, it's not even like an agreement. It's the fact that we have to accept that it, like you even said, like as long as we believe that it is real, then it functions. In which case, let's just assume that that belief is necessitated. Then in which case, then you necessarily have to take a realist position and not an anti-realist position from the very fact that you said, as long as we believe it is real, then it functions.
Yeah, we have to treat it as real,
So if we
but I
have
don't
to
think it's actually real.
So then, in which case, why are you grounding everything in subjectivity? If everything is, and why are you presupposing axioms? If we must treat it as real, you're treating it as not real. You're building it upon an
Because
emotive base.
no, I'm treating it as real. In my day-to-day life, I don't really talk about the subjectivity of mathematics or numbers that much. But yeah, obviously at the end of the day, it comes down to an incredibly complicated set of subjective preferences that people have collectively arrived at.
But like, let's say, like, let's look at like some of the like, and if you agree that it's collective, then it's like socio-politically relative. And what I would say is that in terms of like, sorry, veganism, for example, or socialism, I would say that both of these, both of these positions are instantiated in relation to the ethical principles in which our society holds dear. Like we care about individuals, we care about animals, and we want to maximize the subjectivity of all involved. And I would say, like, if that's the case,
But we could change that if we really wanted to.
what, like, radically, yeah, maybe we could radically reinvent it, but then you'd have to say like why, and like none of that, like, or it would just have to happen, like, regardless.
Because they want to.
Yeah, but you said that you want it to function, don't you? Because you said that as long as things like function the way, like, it's good that they function the way they do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't like the way society is generally, but it's good that we form collective assumptions about first principles or about logic or about mathematics that benefit our collective understanding of the world.
But,
But
like,
yeah, if we wanted to imagine a civilization that didn't care about animal rights, for example, didn't think they were even conscious, then if they arrived at that position, I would think that's wrong. But I couldn't like objectively argue them out of it if they
but I think,
really wanted to.
what I kind of hate about this is just the idea of you using words like, for example, when you use a word like benefit, and there's no like when you say that word, it doesn't actually mean anything unless it has some sort of like expressible idea, right? Like you could otherwise be going like, oh, when we blah, and then that's it, right? Like it's like, and then you
Well,
just
if you
fill in
want to
the.
get really reductive, when I say something benefits society, what I actually mean is it makes me happy.
Well, this is the thing, and
Uh,
like, but even understanding what makes you happy is an assumption unless you're able to ground that, which would be why egoism has to be objective and not subjective, right?
No,
Like,
it's an assumption and it is subjective. I'm assuming what I want.
but
No
that
man
doesn't
can know
make
their
it.
own mind,
But
right?
that means that it's not necessarily what you want. So it's not necessary. So why would you call it that? You just say
Because it's
I'm
what I
assuming.
think I want. But
So
all we can do is say what we think we want. I mean, nobody can actually know what they want. We can only know what we think we want. Everything we know and believe is filtered through our ability to understand ourselves and the world around us. And that's the reason
why do you
why I'm a
think that?
moral
But
anti-realist, by the way.
why do you think that?
Why everything we think follows after what we are? What do I think what?
Well, why do you think, like for example, why do you take moral anti-realism to be true? Like, what argument instantiates that position?
Because I don't think that it's possible to make objective statements about metaphysical things.
And why? Why do you think that it's not possible to make objective metaphysical statements?
Because I think that our both our faculties of reason and the means by which we perceive the world around us are limited entirely to the physical.
Okay, and why do you think that?
Because I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. That seems to be what we're limited to.
You see, like, this is kind of what I'm going down. Like, I don't know if you noticed, I just kept saying why because it's sufficient reason, right? Like,
Well,
obviously,
eventually, if you can keep asking why if you want, but eventually I say like because we can't. But I'm comfortable with that answer. I don't think humans can make commentary on metaphysical issues. We can't. We're physical beings.
it's
But issues like what is objectively right or wrong, these things don't exist in the world. Nowhere in all the universe, nowhere with a telescope or a microscope can I find what is morally right or wrong. These are conclusions that we arrive at.
oh,
And as long as we arrive
absolutely
at right
can.
conclusions,
You absolutely
hmm,
can. Like one, you don't have to like one. It hasn't like understanding that the universe is purely physical anyway relies upon a reductionary take, which isn't necessarily like the case, and is a
I can't, wait,
metaphysical
wait, you
claim.
can't. Are you wait? Are you religious? You're not going to sell me on the metaphysical.
Oh no. I'm an idealist. I'm an objective idealist. So like as I said, I was a Hegelian. So like essentially, I was going to say like fundamentally, and this is actually what you should be believing in anyway. In many ways, because if you take materialism to be the metaphysical foundation, then like truth would be grounded in the senses. If you don't take that to be the case, then you'd say that truth exists in like individual participation in understanding reality. Then you're a phenomenalist, right? So like I'm an objective idealist, so it's somewhere between the two. Like I believe that
I
there
can't
is
speak to the specifics, but yeah, truth is what we can observe in reality.
yeah.
But
So
nobody knows what they're observing perfectly, and nobody knows what other people have observed perfectly. So the process of arriving at what we collectively understand to be a truth is a subjective one.
yeah, so like what I'm trying to express here is that ultimately like every argument you're making for the anti-realist position is built upon a level of skepticism which isn't in and of itself assumed. So why are you making this assumption that like this is like so for example, if this level of skepticism undermines the metaphysical normativity for me to make the claim in the first place, then why should I believe this skepticism is true if it ultimately shows why it can't be true? Like, why
How
do
can the
I?
skepticism not be true?
Well, like, so for example, like the skepticism itself, like Fourier skepticism, for example, like if I just start like basically being skeptic about everything, like Descartes' evil demon, I ultimately undermine my reason and my understanding of reality, which means that the argument itself and my understanding of it is also undermined. So I've been so skeptical that I've destroyed my own skepticism.
Yeah, but you can be skeptical of that too.
This
Didn't
is the
think of
thing.
that,
Yeah,
did you?
no, but it's an infinite regress, isn't it? So there's no like ultimately, in
There's
which
no
case
end.
this is
No,
this is
actually, no, you can't. There's no answer.
well,
You can't arrive at it.
no, but this is exactly what Kant talks about, and he understood this like what like
Yeah,
300
fuck
years
Kant.
ago. Yeah, but 300 years ago he understood that
Yeah,
there
he
was
was
a
wrong
whirlpool.
300 years ago.
Well,
Sucks to be Kant, huh?
some ways he was wrong, but in this way he's coming to the same conclusion as you. So I wouldn't necessarily like, throw him under the bus. Like, essentially, he was saying that you end up in a whirlpool, like of essentially not being able to understand reality. Like you end up
Hmm?
losing any grounding. Now he says then you basically have to accept reason and logic functions. Now I would say that that is necessitated as well. That there is no getting around that. Even for the argument to function in and of itself, it won't function unless you accept it. It's like trying to talk yourself out of words, and that's why even someone like Wittgenstein says, "Look, it's the way you think. It's the very thinking itself. There is no getting away from it, and so we have to accept reason. And if we have to accept reason, and we can build arguments from reason, then we can essentially necessarily and sufficiently
We can accept. I disagree. We can accept a reason. We can accept something we've cobbled together. I don't think there is a pure reason. I don't think there is some sort of objective understanding of this from which a greater understanding of these issues can be derived. I think that our reason, our faculties of reason, at the end of the day, are almost in a Platonic sense, a copy of an ideal. That somewhere in our imaginations there is a perfect reason, but what we have is flawed.
Oh, I
And
completely
that's
agree. I
what we're
completely agree.
always going to be stuck with.
Oh, I completely. You see, I don't think so. I think that ultimately, by accepting that, like P, for example, always must, obtain P, doesn't mean that P is exactly what it is, right? Like it's like we must accept like the law of identity, and so on, right? Like classical logic to some degree. And if that's the
Well, wait,
case,
we can accept it. We can accept it because it provides positive utility for us.
no, I think I would. You
We don't
see,
have to understand the universe.
I
We
would.
only have to convince ourselves that we do.
You see, I would disagree. It's not that we have to accept it just because it provides positive utility, because positive utility is like even in the way of being words or concepts that would be unavailable to us until we actually accept like this logical function. Like it's not something. It's the very thinking in which we engage in, right?
Now, I think people are capable of intuitively making decisions about what they find right or wrong, even if they don't have a foundational understanding of epistemology, just because they can basically assign like what makes them happy, or what do they derive pleasure from. And in that instance, I think people are perfectly capable of forming some cobbled together half-assed reason and convincing themselves the universe works a given way. And as long as that makes them happy, I think that's just fine. I accept that.
See, I
If
wouldn't.
people, if we so this is I got over a lot of my existential terror about the world by thinking of things in this way. That at the end of the day, we are like adrift in the cosmos, incapable of understanding ourselves and each other. But there's no alternative. If the metaphysical doesn't exist, then all of this bullshit about pure reason and pure ethics and like the morally grounded epistemology, these things don't exist.
But neither
All
does
we
neither
can
does science, obviously.
There's science, yeah, but everything about science is subjective too.
No,
We
that's what I'm
arrive
saying.
at
Like
subjective.
all of it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that it's like just like biting the bullet on the companions in guilt.
I think that metaphysics are things that we choose to believe in because we want an ideal to strive towards, but all reality exists within the physical material world. And because we are limited to it and limited to our very weak and biological means of interacting with it, there's no way to actually achieve anything even coming close to pure reason or an interaction with the pure metaphysical. That it will always
I can
remain like a cultural signifier to chase after, but it can never actually touch us. It can never affect
I
us.
can kind of understand what you're saying there. To be entirely honest with you, like don't get me wrong, I disagree, but I like I'll say like look, even like the biological take, obviously you know that itself is built on a certain normativity, and we've already said that like the normativity grounding everything, there has to be a certain level that's accepted, and I would say that like that's at least classical logic. But what I'd say like as soon as we accept that, then we've accepted a certain way of engaging with reality, and if we've accepted that like reality must conform to a certain way of thinking and a certain way of understanding, logos, logic, then ultimately logic itself can progress. Don't get me wrong, we can get a better understanding of logic and how it functions. Anyway, so like, I don't think that we necessarily end up being lost in this whirlpool, as you say. Like, one, because I think that if we accept that we are lost in this whirlpool, then all of the claims which would have put us in the whirlpool disappear with him, like with it. So, like, we can't be. And then I would say, like, at the end of the day, if we are being forced to accept a certain necessitated belief in logic, then we can build an objective, or at the very least, a trans-subjective understanding of reality. Now, I
What
would
do you
say
mean
it's
by
a
trans-subjective?
trans-subjective just means existing between multiple agents. Um, so, like,
Oh, well, sure. If we want to say that, that it's possible to form a trans-subjective understanding of metaphysical concepts, then I think I would agree to that. I think it's possible. I mean, not everyone will have a perfect understanding of it, but I think it's possible to develop an understanding of logic or science, which is so foundationally justifiable in how it provides us utility that everyone adopts that same understanding, or at least that everyone can. And that it's not it doesn't vary individual to individual, unless people choose to. That it's a collective social archetype that people can buy into.
But
I think I could agree to that.
why are
If
you
that's a
putting...
type of objectivity, though, that's not what I imagine when I think of objectivity.
That's not objectivity. That's not at all. I don't agree with this, and I think that Robert Brandom explains why, that like the existence of P must always imply the possibility of P, and I think you actually nailed it on the head when you said, look, we have to believe as if it is actually the case, in which case it's necessitated that we accept that it's real. So even if it's trans-subjective, we have to accept that it's real. But like what I would say ultimately as well, like not ultimately I suppose, but why do you keep putting utility beneath everything when utility itself is built upon a certain normativity and metaphysical claim that presupposes it, like precedes it rather?
Well, yeah, because I want to be happy. So all my utility claims revolve around the achievement of whatever axioms
I
I
agree.
think best suit.
I agree. You want to be happy, so you want to express your desires and you want to live a good life. And now that's something that I agree with. But then ultimately, I don't think one that you're necessarily going to fall into a utilitarian framework with that. And I think two, you can understand that in relation to understanding yourself, like as you say, we have to understand like how we express our desires, like understanding that like taking coke might be really nice in the moment, but becoming a coke head, and a coke addict might be detrimental to your own like overall happiness. Now that's like an ethical claim, right? Like you understand that like, look, you're not just trying to maximize a single moment, you're trying to maximize like your entire life, and like, in some level. Now those are ethical arguments in relation to like the value of your experiences, and they are only possible when we start engaging with like your fundamental nature. And your fundamental nature is like you're a human. We understand that you can become a cokehead. We understand that like coke will release was it serotonin? I think coke, isn't it? And so,
Probably, yeah.
yeah. So you will experience positivity from it, and ultimately we can ground that in understanding what you are and how you function. And if we understand that's what you are and how you
Well,
function,
this is the problem that I have with moral realism, because I don't know if it's appropriate to make metaphysical statements based on a collective assumption about human behavior. That to me, it seems to derive objectivity from something as fleeting, inconsistent, and temporal as assumed human behavior seems to me to be like a bastardization of the term.
100% don't agree that like not with you actually. 100% agree with what you've just said in many ways actually. I don't think you can make like deterministic claims about human behavior. I don't believe that psychology is a science. I don't think it even gets close. I don't think that economics is even a science, and so on. Like and I don't think that's even like controversial to say. I just don't think that it creates law-like generalizations which are capable of being made. I actually did a response to Cosmic Skeptic about that, like because he's terrible with that stuff as well. But the and I've spoken to him about it before, but like determinism is really like embedded in society. But the issue is that like if we don't need to accept determinism in relation to like understanding our nature. We don't need to go like, look, you will 100% behave in this way. In fact, we could go like the fact that you're capable of making a choice gives you the possibility of actually receiving like psychological treatment. So like I would even say like, and psychoanalysis, like psychology and psychoanalysis in terms of therapy presupposes that an individual can act in a way in which when they are enlightened to their actions and the consequences, that they can change them, that they can radically reinvent themselves. Now, I will take the existentialist like position on that, like 100%. And I'm like, you sound like an existentialist to me in like a foundation. So if we have that like precondition of choice that allows us to engage and radically invent ourselves within the world, then all we are doing in terms of ethics is understanding what will genuinely bring us the greatest expression of our subjectivity. And if that's the case, then that can be objective. There's no need for that to be like anti-realist, like subjective.
I mean, you say there's no reason for it to be. I just find that a more convincing explanation. When I think of something, so maybe this could be like thresholds that we determine justify something being called objective. When I think of something that's objective, like truly objective, not objective in the sense of, like I say, it's an objective fact that um, the population of the United States' median age is 52. Like, not like that. I mean, objective in the sense that it comments on the metaphysical. I can't think of anything rooted in our understanding of biology. At the end of the day, psychology is a subset of biological and sociological research. And when we talk about objectivity, it's like you can arrive at morally objective positions because it is so necessary to presuppose certain forms of moral engagement that humans by nature of their existence engage in. And I think those things are true, but the most you could arrive at the end of all of that is that we can arrive at moral objectivity for human beings. But is that metaphysical? And I don't even agree with that, by the way. But the most we could arrive at there is objectivity for human beings. But is that really a metaphysical claim? To me, it sounds like a cop out almost.
See, like I wouldn't make.
Yeah, we've solved morality, but only because we kind of understand how humans work in group settings. You know?
I understand what you're saying, but see, I wouldn't go that. I wouldn't like start there. I would start where Hegel starts at the bottom of the dialectic. Like, what must we assume?
I
And
haven't read Hegel.
Oh, I know. Well,
wait, hold on. I just realized I said a lot, and it's unfair of me to cut you off now. I just realized that we've been talking for 2 hours,
oh, really?
And that I promised my chat a chill game stream. Can I encourage you to leave a final meme? I actually ended up enjoying this kind of a lot. A final meme, and then we'll have to part ways so I can beat Bloodborne or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, fundamentally, I'll just say, like, when we engage in ethics, we don't need to make like assumptions in relation to like certain like collective human engagement. Like, what we can do is understand what is necessary in terms of logic, and then what can be built off that sufficiently. And I would say that what is necessary is logical thinking, and the expression of subjectivity, that we can't help but value that which is valuable. And then from that position, we come to understand like desire in a first order sense, expressing what, like, you know, subjectivism, quote unquote. But then subjectivism leads us to an understanding that we try to express subjectivity in an objective way, in a way that is able to overcome epistemological flaws and express you know, our desires in the greatest possible way, express the greatest possible freedom. And I'd say that's, you know, very much available in a Hegelian framework. And if you want to understand that better in a very clear and easy way, check out Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. It's on Audible as an audiobook. I understand people suffer, like, obviously from struggling to read and stuff. So do I. I've got dyspraxia. It's absolutely doable. So yeah, thank you for the conversation, and I genuinely hope that you go vegan, and you promote doing the right thing. You know.
I promise to say I promote veganism. I can't make any promises with my personal behavior. You know, we're getting pretty close to lab-grown meat, aren't we? Or like at least really, really good fake meat.
Closer and closer, but ultimately, like, it's not really like achievable like en masse yet, and it's also still requiring
Not
like
yet, no.
animal cells for like each culture to be grown. I don't know if we've even established a permaculture yet, so it's like constantly biopsying an animal and stuff.
I tell you, what we really need is good vegan. We have okay vegan butter, I think. What we need is good vegan cheese. That's what we need. Honestly, I could live without meat, but butter and cheese are necessary components in a lot of incredibly good food. So if we could get really good replacements for those, you know?
If you get the chance, it's a proper gourmet version. Like, don't get me wrong. So it's like £7 a tub, but it's actually made.
I am wealthy.
It's actually made from my area. It's like quite a small business. It's called Tyne Cheese. It's the best cheese. It's like cashews, like, and probiotics that's like fermented like a normal cheese. It's like unbelievable, like proper cheese board cheese. Really great.
One thing I learned recently is that you can use the liquid that you get in cans of garbanzo beans, and that works as a substitute for egg whites, like almost perfectly.
Oh yeah,
It just gives it a slightly more earthy flavor, but otherwise chemically it does almost exactly the same thing.
If you add sugar as well, you can even make like a meringue and stuff, and it'll like work like really well. So that's like, I've done it before. You've got to proper whisk it and stuff, but like, yeah, it absolutely does work. And actually, if you want like a really based like meat replacement, like animal product replacement, like food science channel, check out Source Stash on YouTube. He's actually brilliant at like how to like mimic and replace like certain animal products in like the most convincing way, if that's what you're going for.
All right. Well, one maybe one day we'll get an answer to the cheese question. Okay.
Yeah, no, but
Thank you for coming on, Mr. Perspective Philosophy.
yeah, thanks for having us on. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.